Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. I hope you're having a fabulous weekend, and before we get started, don't forget to go and get yourself that quintessential perfect drink, and if it's something unusual, I like to hear about it. But before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, I had not been back to my hometown for a long, long time. My life in those early impressionable years had been tumultuous to say the very least. Some things are hard to forget. Some memories refuse to be eradicated from your mind, hanging on to your recollections so hard, like the unyielding clusters of barnacles tightly clinging to a ship's hull. I wasn't surprised to hear the sound of my heart fluttering in my chest, almost as if hundreds of panicking pigeons were flapping inside me. I'm not sure whether it was nervous anxiety or an excited anticipation that had brought on these inexplicable feelings. I had driven down the long driveway as stealthily as I could, determined not to draw attention to myself, for I knew the crunching sound of my tyres grazing against the gravel might easily be heard as my car neared its approach. In such circumstances, it was hard to be discreet. It would seem the twilight had finally surrendered to the morning, as a soft light glittered over the valley, peering faintly through the sky that was still stained with a grey shadow that was slowly but surely slinking away. I hoped that the two occupants of my old family home were still blissfully fast asleep, that they had not heard my clandestine approach. I needed a brief moment just to gather my bearings, to become reacquainted with my old beloved house that I'd grown up in as a young girl. I had arrived earlier than was expected. I felt a little like being whisked off in a surreal dream, like Scrooge in the Christmas Carol, being guided by the ghosts of Christmas past, to look back on another time, to stare through the glass windows, to see myself as a young girl again. I could hear the sound of my father's drunken intoxication, as my parents laughed about nonsensical things that weren't even remotely funny. My father would often put his shoes in the refrigerator, thinking it was a shoe rack. My mother, in her attempts to make pasta, would often put pasta quills in the toaster, and on one occasion she even began deep-frying the cream-rolled-up socks from the laundry basket in the fat fryer, falsely thinking that they were peeled potatoes. For most of my childhood, my parents had been like passing ships in the night, whose moments of sobriety were few and far between. Growing up, I'd often felt rather neglected by the two people who were supposed to love me most in the world, whom had outstandingly failed to handle their parental responsibilities. They masterfully hid their cloak-and-dagger secret binge drinking behind the cover of darkness, so that during the day my father would return to work like the pillar of the community, appearing in every regard to be the perfect parent, co-worker and even boss to all who knew him. They would be guilefully deceived. Never would they have ever gleamed he was an alcoholic, not even for a moment. In truth, my father was like a man who suddenly turned into a werewolf at night, although having said that, he was not an aggressive drunk. But when he was half cut, it was like he was caught up in his own illusory world. Likewise, my mother managed to maintain a similar deceptive facade, sometimes even turning up for sports events at my school, or even a school fete, like a dutiful, loving parent. But once my parents crossed over the threshold of the front door and returned home at the end of a long, tiring day, when the sun began to set over the valley, to soon embrace the twilight hours, they would make a natural beeline towards the refrigerator, and then they would grab the icy-cold bottles of wine, relinquishing the frayed masks they'd been wearing during the day. They would recharge their hungry alcoholic batteries with what their bodies rudely demanded. Soon they would become incarcerated by their alcoholic cravings that held them to ransom, to an unbalanced state of mind. It was only after my father had died 15 years ago from liver failure that my mother had found a new lease to her life, and like a butterfly emerging from its silken confinement, she reinvented herself. She suddenly got her act together, joined Alcoholics Anonymous, became sober, changed her life around, and got remarried. I will never forget the indelible day when I picked up my cell phone and noticed my mother's name highlighted on the caller ID. I could hear my mother's voice on the end of the line. I hadn't spoken to her for an age, so her fortuitous phone call was a welcome surprise. I was shocked to hear her crying at the other end of the phone. I thought she was going to tell me she'd been diagnosed with cirrhosis of the liver, or she had a deadly cancer of some kind. My heart began leapfrogging in my mouth. I was terrified about what she was about to convey to me, as her reluctance to speak made my thoughts veer off in an uncertain direction, like a truck hanging on the edge of a cliff face over a precariously high drop. "Mum, is everything all right?" I asked, the earnest words tumbling quickly out of my mouth. "Please, God," I was thinking, "don't give me any bad news. Please, no." It's me, Christina," came a timorous voice at the end of the phone. "Is that you, Mum?" I had asked again. You sound so far away, so faint. Maybe our connection is not terribly good. Could you try and speak up? I can hear you better then. Is everything all right with you?" "I'm here, sweetheart," came the voice. Then she blubbered, "I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I ruined your childhood. I want to try again and be the mother for you that you deserve. I failed you when you were little. Can you please find it in your heart to forgive me?" "What's brought all this on, Mum? What's it all about? You'll always be my mother to me. Nothing can change that. Why are you being so, dramatic about things?" "I'm clean and sober, sweetheart. And at Alcoholics Anonymous, we're expected to phone everyone that we've ever hurt. In truth, this is a phone call that is well overdue. It's been a long time in coming, and it's taken a whole lot of courage for me to do it. I did try to phone you last week, I really did, and every day since then. But it's so hard. I mean, what words of apology can ever make up for what I did back then? I'm so utterly ashamed. I was quite the most irresponsible, appalling mother. I didn't deserve such a lovely daughter like you." "Mum, all is forgiven and long forgotten. I am glad you phoned me, but you don't need to ever be afraid of phoning me, nor do you need to apologise. I'm your daughter, for goodness sake. I hold no grudges towards the past. I know you had issues with alcohol. It happens, but it doesn't make you a monster. You were never that, you know. You did have your moments when you were a rather good mother. There were good times. It wasn't all bad. And sometimes when you were drunk, you could do hilarious things. You had your moments, like when you parked the car in the pond, and when you cried so hard because your button had popped off your shirt, and you thought it the most calamitous thing that had ever happened to you." "Sweetheart, that's the point, isn't it? There shouldn't have been any bad times. There were far too many of them. I let you down. I wasn't there for you when you needed me. You must have felt so isolated as a child, so desperately alone, abandoned by your own parents. Oh, I hate myself for what I was doing back then, getting drunk with your father all the time. I'm not making excuses for myself. I need to take responsibility for my own actions, of course I do, as at the end of the day, I was the one that poured the booze down my throat. But I will say this in my defence. Your father, he encouraged me to drink with him. Once I started to drink, to let off steam and to be social, it became an addiction that I couldn't control. It crept up on me unaware. All I could think about was my next drink. Your father, he was so, how can I put it, controlling, domineering. But when he had a drink, he would lighten up, become so much nicer. So I didn't discourage him from drinking, because I liked him in that frame of mind. Do you remember how he hated me driving that old car of mine? Yes, I remember that. He was always panicky when you drove. He didn't trust you behind the wheels of your car. He was such a perfectionist, wasn't he? So dogmatically fastidious. And you were much more insouciant than he was. I think he always believed that you were going to drive your car into the next tree. To your credit, you did stand up for yourself. You would get quite reactive. I'm not going to drive into that bloody tree, you'd say. But I'll do that if you stop treating me as if I'm a beginner. I've been driving for years. I remember Dad would say back to you, You may have been driving for years, sweetheart, but by all accounts, not very well. That's exactly what he was like. Your father had no faith in me at all. In his eyes, I could never do anything right. My driving wasn't good enough. The food I cooked, he claimed, was barely edible. Which was probably true when I come to think of it. I never claimed to be a domestic goddess when I married him, though. I do remember one evening he threw the serving dish of buttered carrots at the wall, so they scattered all over the dining room. The serving dish naturally shattered. There was white china everywhere. I can't eat these, he screamed at me. You turned the carrots into baby food. Do I look like I've moved on to solids and need my food pulverized? Next you'll be giving me a high chair, a bib, feeding me out of a plastic spoon, wiping the mess away from my face. It was a mistake, I told him. I overcooked them. It happens. He looked at me and said, You can never get anything right, can you, dear? So, yes, your father's exacting standards weren't exactly easy to live with by any manner of means. Let's just say when he had a drink or two, his peevish pettiness, condescending supercilious put-downs would just whittle away like smoke on the wind. He'd become a nicer, much more happy-go-lucky person. Believe me, we would have some laughs back then. He'd insist I drank with him, as he didn't ever want to drink alone. In those early days, I was a reluctant drinker, but seeing your father becoming so convivial, I was encouraged to drink with him. And despite everything, I loved your father, which was why I put up with his nitpicking for so long. Much longer than I should have done. Before I knew it, one bottle of wine had veered into another, and soon I became as blooded as he was. Let's just say before I married your father, I had a grim view of alcoholics, I really did. So did your father, for that matter, as he'd grown up with an alcoholic father. Ostensibly, I thought alcoholics had absolutely no self-discipline. Now, of course, I know very different. I mean, as I was telling you, every day I would go off to work, and all I could think about was going home to my next drink. It completely consumed my life. Your father, he was lucky. He had great self-discipline. He could go cold turkey for hours on end and come back and begin drinking. He'd get terribly plastered. My greatest regret is so often we forgot all about you. Well, I preferred Dad when he'd had a few drinks in him, I have to admit that. He could get so thorny and prickly when he was sober, about things in the house that didn't meet his satisfaction. He would tell me my grades weren't good enough. He was disappointed in me. But after a drink or two, he was sweet to me, until of course he was completely sozzled. Then he wouldn't even know I was actually there. Why do you think he liked to drink in the first place, Mother? It was an escapism for him, wasn't it? He grew up in a household when his dad was never ever sober. Growing up, your father despised him for always being so legless, but he told me he knew his dad drank to escape his nagging wife. Let's just say that woman, I met her once, never again. She was a nasty piece of work, nagged and nagged and nagged about absolutely everything. She was such a perfectionist. I think inadvertently your father picked up her nitpicking habits. I remember one day when he was sober, he said to me, I have become my mother. Everything I hated about her, I have become. I keep nagging you, and when I drink, I become my father, and I hate how he drunk. I've become everything I loathed about both of my parents. I have become my parents. It really distressed him, you know. I think in truth we needed professional counselling, the both of us. That would have really changed our lives. I think you're right, Mum. Dad was caught up in becoming everything he didn't want to be, as I expect his childhood influenced him negatively, as that's the only life he was exposed to growing up. It kind of rubs off on you, you know. Well, after he died, sweetheart, I knew I was going to join him in that grave, if I didn't watch myself. Your father's cirrhosis, well, it was a real wake-up call for me. The doctor warned me if I carried on in the same way, I was heading down the same path. I had to fix my life. And I have. Believe it or not, sweetheart, I've been sober for a year. She pauses for a moment. and almost whispers down the phone. Actually, sweetheart, I've got something else to tell you. Something really rather wonderful. I hope you'll be happy for me. I've met someone. He's such a wonderful, wonderful man. I know you'll like him. He's very good for me. And it helps he doesn't drink either. His name is Tom. What did you say, Mother? You've met someone? Yes, it's quite extraordinary, really, how that came about. One of the young women at AA, who's about your age, she started to drink like a fish after her mother died. She was so grievously upset about her mother's demise, so she drank and drank. Her father was helping her to get sober. He knew that his daughter's habits were destroying her, so he was all hands on deck in helping her recover. On a few occasions, he sat there with her during those AA meetings when people stand up and confess that they're an alcoholic. He told me he recognized my smile from years and years and years ago. It had made such an impression on him back then when I was at school. We realized we'd been at school together. He was a year above me. Would you believe that? Then he asked me out. Well, the rest is history. I think we both knew after the first date that there was a spark between us and a connection that I never felt with your father. So we're going to get married in a couple of months' time, in true Las Vegas style. One of those wedding chapels there. We don't want any fuss. We're far too old for all of that. But we want to make it special, personal, you know. We'd love you to come along and celebrate with us. We'll cover the costs of the flights and the hotel and all that. We'll be booking into the Trump Hotel. Needless to say, his daughter will be there too. She's excited to meet you. She's also been sober for a whole year now. She's one of the lucky ones, you know. Do you know she doesn't want to drink alcohol ever again? She hates the taste of the stuff now. Oh, my word, I wish that had happened to me. Some people get all the luck, don't they? I'm so happy for you, Mum. I say, tears streaming down my face. I'm so proud of you that you've been sober for an entire year. That really is an achievement. Believe me, darling, I'm never going to touch that stuff again. I've been learning to meditate as a way of dealing with my cravings. And one day during my meditation, I actually heard my father's voice in my head saying, I'm going to kill her if she ever touches the stuff again. It scared me to the quick, I'll tell you. I completely stopped drinking after that. My father, let's just say, he could be quite a tyrant. That's incredible, Mum. I'm so pleased. Ever since then, my mother and I had lifted up the residues of our battered relationship. We had soon become firm friends, talking to each other every other day on Skype. Our relationship had blossomed exponentially. It had not been hard to forgive her. She was my mother. Despite everything, I loved her very much. My childhood would have been perfect if things had been different back then. But you cannot live your life basking under a white fluffy cloud of if-onlys. You need to pick up the pieces, make the most of them, however broken up they may be. Me and my mother had suddenly become quite close. The last time I'd seen her had been in Vegas at the wedding, but this was the first time I'd been back home in years. It felt rather strange to be back, and I wasn't quite sure exactly what I was feeling. It was impossible to find the words to describe the experience of returning back home after so many years. Much had changed, but on the other hand, so much had also remained the same. For a long, wistful moment, charged with the fragrant, honeyed infusions of my sentimentality, I sat anchored in my truck, rooted to the spot, parked in the driveway, just staring and staring at my old house, as if I was looking at it through new, dewy eyes, like a stranger that had never cast eyes on it before. Our charming house was nestled in the foothills of the Virginian countryside, located about an hour's drive away from Charleston. How much I had loved this home, despite the many secrets that had remained hidden behind its walls for many years, of which only 3 of us had been privy to, as the outside world remained obliviously ignorant of what had actually transpired here. I had a deep affection for this place. The viridescent, heavily treed countryside that surrounded the property was so spectacular. It had been to me like a friend, especially when I'd felt so dreadfully alone. I glanced towards the thick, verdant fringe of trees that spreads out into a large, sprawling woodgrove. I feel a wistful nostalgia consume me, almost as if the trees are inviting me to walk in their mist again. I am tempted to do as much. I feel a magnetic tug drawing me towards them. I can see myself as a little girl again, playing so happily in that woodgrove, interacting with one of the squirrels that had become so tame. I remember it would jump on my shoulder, eat its acorns on me. The squirrel had been my friend for many years. I called him Acorn, but one day I never ever saw him again. I cried for weeks after that. I was inconsolable with grief. I knew he was gone for good. I had placed a memorial plaque up for him in the woods, that my mother informs me is still there to this very day. It says, "To little Acorn, may you rest in peace. You'll never ever be forgotten," along with the date when I actually stopped seeing him. I had always loved trees. They gave me strength when I felt downcast. I looked at the old serene apple tree that still remained stoically poised, facing the second floor of our house, positioned so perfectly outside my bedroom window. I noticed it had grown significantly larger over the years, and was still boasting vibrantly good health. I shudder as I remember the countless amount of times I had clandestinely sneaked out of my bedroom window, climbing out onto the apple tree, and then to the ground below, just so that I could lie back on the grass in the middle of the night and stare up at the Milky Way. It was something I loved to do. I probably could have stealthily crept through the house in a more civilized way when the parents were drunk, but at that age, dicing with death had been quite thrilling. Even though one wrong move, if I'd fallen off that tree, it would not have been terribly difficult to snap my neck. But at that invincible age, when you falsely assume you're going to live forever, I never entertained such doubtful thoughts or gave them even a fleeting consideration, because that's how you are when you're that young. The classical symmetrical house I'd grown up in as a young girl, with its elegant arched windows lined with white trim, wore her age remarkably well. The walls were not wrinkled, tired, or faded, nor did cracks trespass across her red-bricked facade, so her appearance had not changed in 15 years. Yet she somehow looked more mellow, comfortable in her own skin, as if over the last 15 years the house had become happier, as if subtly influenced by the more upbeat mood of the people currently in residence there. It would seem their residual happiness was worn on the exterior of the home, like a happy coat of paint that you could tangibly feel. I got the profound sense the house was actually smiling at me, the windows winking in the soft morning light. I can see the indelible influences and hallmarks of my mother's unbridled happiness in the front yard, as a heart-shaped flower bed has confiscated a prominent position in the lawn, where colourful roses tumble happily between blue salvia and French lavender. Then at her front door there are terracotta pots that display hanging geraniums in abundant bloom. My mother would never have given the yard such detailed considerations before, when she was governed by the formidable oppression of alcohol. In those days it was not blooming flowers that arrested her attention, but perennial bottles of white wine that usually carried the name Sauvignon Blanc, Chardonnay grown in the Napa Valley, or Riesling. I climb out of my truck, staring up at my mother's bedroom window. The curtains are tightly drawn. There's no sign of any life, until I suddenly see a very big fat ginger cat trotting towards me, as if it's known me all its life. I've never met such a congenial cat before. It purrs like a machine, rubbing its oversized, rather tubby body against my legs, almost as if marking its territory. The cat has obviously decided to lay some kind of claim on me. For me personally, it's love at first sight. The cat is adorable. He reminds me of Puss in Boots in the story of Shrek. He's got that audacious confidence and assertiveness that I find rather charming. He wears a mischievous glint in his eyes. "Hello there, you must be little Spud. Not so little really, are you?" I say, leaning down to give the cat a very big affectionate cuddle. This must be Tom Farrow's cat, which became part of our family when my mother married the man. A light breeze is blowing against my face, which I rather like, and a soft sprinkle of morning sunlight is wrestling its way through the clouds. It seems that this very savvy Spud has grabbed that beam of sunlight all to himself and is basking in it as he begins to clean himself, lifting his leg up to his abrasive tongue. Clever boy! You've hogged all the warmth this morning, haven't you? I wouldn't have minded that sunbeam for myself, thank you very much. That's when I hear my mother's excited screams from the upstairs windows. Oh! Oh! She waves at me from the upper floor. In a trice, the front door of my old family home bursts open, and the rambunctious wind of my mother's enthusiasm bolts out of the house like an ebullient dog that has not seen its master in an age, and is moving so fast in a tearing hurry. If I'm not careful, I might just be blown over. My mother throws her arm around me, giving me a huge, warm, congenial hug. You're back home, sweetheart. This is wonderful. I didn't know you were coming back so early. If I'd known, I would be dressed more appropriately. Look at me. I'm still wearing my pyjamas. My hair is as flat as a pancake. I must look like a sorry sight for sore eyes. Don't be silly, Mum. You look great. My mother glances down at Spud, basking in the sunlight, and smiles. I see you've met Spud. He's quite the character, isn't he? Moments later, Tom comes ambling out of the house, wearing a tartan dressing gown over his pyjamas and velvety blue slippers on his feet. He hurries towards me, embracing me with his open arms, almost as if I'm his real daughter. It's very flattering. He used to be a fireman before he retired. He's got such a warm, engaging personality. You cannot help but love him from the moment you meet him. Oh, it's wonderful to see you, Christina. It really is wonderful. And my word, don't you look marvellous. How long has it been since you've been back home? Believe it or not, Tom, it's been about 15 years. I can't believe I've been away for so long. But I had to leave this place after my divorce with Bruno. I couldn't stay here after that. I needed to make some space between us. And very understandable in the circumstances. But now you're back because of him. Is that not ironic? Life is peculiarly strange at times. Well, in a manner of speaking, that is true. But it's also the quintessential opportunity to come home and to see the two of you. Well, what does it feel like to be back? It's great to be back, but it feels rather surreal. The trees in the woodgrove look enormous, the mountains in the distance much the same as I remember, and our red-bricked home looks as if she hasn't aged a single day. In truth, she seems happier, more settled, certainly more vibrant with the introduction of roses in the front yard. Well, that's my influence, I'm afraid, says Tom. I'm very passionate about roses, which is why I married one, he says, taking my mother in his arms and giving her an affectionate kiss on the cheek. For a moment I'm flooded with the green-eyed monster, as a dreadful envy ribbons through my veins that I try to suppress, but it's not terribly easy. I never knew there would be a day I'd actually be jealous of my own mother. I've not been so lucky in my love life, as over the years, having embarked on many failed relationships, I've almost given up on the notion of love. It seems to have somewhat eluded me. I wish someone could love me like Tom and my mother love each other. If they found each other so late in the day, I remind myself there's still hope for me. I'm not a complete lost cause. Over the years, I had reluctantly scanned all manner of dating websites, to no avail. I almost felt as if I was on a shopping website looking for the perfect pair of sneakers to purchase online and not knowing which ones to choose. I almost expected to see the words "add to shopping cart" at the bottom of the photographs posted of the men that I was looking at. In truth, looking for the right man to date is like playing that game you did as a kid when you try to attach a paper fish to the end of a fishing line with a magnetic hook. You have no idea what you're going to get. I'd never been good at playing that game as a kid. I usually ended up with a fish that looked like it had 3 heads. My dating life was no different. Truly, some of those websites should come with a danger warning sign in red, saying, "Be warned, some packages may not be what they seem." Let's just say I had gone on a few dates, but the relationships had never blossomed or grown into anything meaningful or worthwhile. On one occasion, the chap told me he was very sorry. He hadn't contacted me sooner, but his bat had died, and he was grievously upset about it. So I naturally arrived on the date with a condolence card, because I felt sorry for him, expressing my deep regrets for the tragic death of his bat, and that may it rest in peace. He looked at me incredulously when I told him it was a sympathy card for his pet bat that had died.
I don't own a pet bat. It was my cell phone battery that died.
The man possibly thought I was really off my trolley, but he had sounded so distressed about his bat dying that it never occurred to me he was actually talking about his battery. My mother's peachy skin seems younger than it was when I was a little girl, but in those days the booze had not been generous to her complexion. Her eyes had been permanently bloodshot. She'd wear dark black circles under her eyelids, like the pronounced tide marks on a wooden table. My mother was in her 60s, but she didn't look a day over 40. I think her happiness had eroded the years away, as she positively glowed. Suffice to say, that is something that no amount of Botox or fillers can do for your skin. If you could bottle happiness, it would be sold out within the first hour, and people would be lathering it over their skins to get that perfect glow. When you're happy, your body grows younger. Even Tom looks younger than I remembered. He's the same age as my mother. It would seem he was a class above her at the local high school that they had attended together. On one occasion he dashed past my mother, bumping into her so hard that the file she was carrying burst apart. All her papers had gone flying over the corridor, while some were blowing across the schoolyard. Tom remembers flushing with embarrassment. He quickly helped her retrieve the papers that were flapping in the wind and blowing away. I gather he handed my mother this battered heap of papers. "I'm really sorry," he had said. "It's all right," said my mother, giving him a warm smile. "But I'm very sorry. It was all my fault. I should have looked where I was going. I was in a bit of a rush, you see." He hurried away, glancing at my mother over his shoulders one more time. He said he'd never forgotten my mother's warm smile, although they never crossed paths again at that high school. "Don't just stand there, sweetheart," says my mother. "Come on in. I'll make you some breakfast if you like." "I don't eat breakfast, Mum, but a cup of coffee will be just what the doctor ordered for me." "You don't eat breakfast? Goodness gracious," says my mother, looking appalled. "It's the most important meal of the day. Did you not know that? I hope you're looking after yourself. You can't afford to get any thinner, you know." Before long, I was sitting at the kitchen table with Tom and my mother, who were now dressed. Tom had removed my suitcase from the back of the trunk and placed it in my old bedroom, which had now welcomed a soft coat of pale pink paint and a new gold and pink comforter, which magnanimously was spread across the bed. There was also a huge vase of roses on the dressing table. But even with these facelifts, the bedroom was exactly as I remembered it, with bookshelves stacked with my old books that I had read as a girl, and a few of my ancient teddy bears perched on a dresser, but they looked as good as new, as not even a speckle of dust could be seen anywhere. My mother poured me a warm cup of coffee. I glance at my feet to see that Spud is brushing his body against my legs. It's a cosy feeling. It gives me the sense of belonging. My mother is preparing breakfast for Tom. She fries up some eggs and bacon for him, while she sits down to eat some toast and marmalade. "Oh, I completely forgot," she says, walking over to the kitchen counter. "This came for you yesterday afternoon," she says, handing me a glamorous-looking package, tied elegantly with a large red bow. "But I don't understand. Who would send me a parcel?" I say, looking at my mother nonplussed. "Nobody knows I'm here." My mother flushes. "I think I may have mentioned it in town, that you were coming back to attend to the details of Bruno's will. You know how word gets around here. I said you'd be staying with me for a while. It's probably one of your friends from high school, welcoming you back. Well, go on then. Aren't you going to open it? I'm intrigued to see what it contains." I hurriedly remove the pretty red bow and tear away the expensive wrapping and open up the gold box lined with red tissue paper. All eyes watch me. But there's nothing inside the box, only a piece of gold cardboard which says, "You're next," in bold red writing. "What's wrong?" asks my mother, as I stare at the box, unable to comprehend what I'm seeing. "Go on, don't keep us in suspense a moment longer. Let's see what it is." "For goodness sake, darling, tell us. I can't bear it a moment longer." I look at my mother, startled. "I don't understand. There's nothing in here." "But it was addressed to you," my mother insisted. "It was posted at the front door yesterday afternoon." "Maybe the person forgot to put the present inside the box. That happened to me once. It's an easy mistake to make, you know. Oh, I was so embarrassed about that. It was for a wedding. I can't imagine what the bride must have thought when she opened up the empty box. The next day I got a courier to deliver the present to her, so somehow I redeemed myself after that. It's not a mistake, Mum. There's a note in the box. It says you're next. What can that mean? It's really creepy, almost cryptic.
What is that supposed to mean? Asked Tom, saying the words out loud to himself. You're next.
I've no idea, but I have to say, it sounds ominous. You don't suppose the person that murdered Bruno is now after me? I mean, I was his wife. The words you're next sound awfully suggestive. For goodness sake, sweetheart, look at you. You've been divorced from Bruno for 15 years now. You're making his murder sound like an Agatha Christie novel. I doubt anybody is after you. Why would they be? You've done nothing to upset anyone. People love you around here. Maybe you're next means you're next for a good surprise. It doesn't have to be a bad surprise, does it? I paused for a moment. Well, someone murdered Bruno, and the police have no idea who it was that killed him. They interviewed me on Skype, you know. They believed the murder was personal. They found a note next to his body, you know.
Really, says Tom, raising a brow. That does sound rather warped. What did it say?
It said, may you rot in hell. Oh dear, says my mother, wiping the crumbs that have gathered around her mouth away with her napkin. It was a dreadful, dreadful affair, wasn't it? I'll never forget when the police showed up at our door, asking us all kinds of impertinent questions about Bruno and your marriage to the man. They wanted to know if we knew of anyone from way back then who had an axe to grind with the man. They also wanted to know how your relationship had ended with Bruno all those years ago, and why it had ended. Details like that. I'll tell you one thing, that police officer, what was his name? She asks, looking at Tom for the answer.
Officer Johansson, says Tom, clearing his throat. Never met a man like him. He was like a perennial weed, arriving at our front door again and again rather too regularly, asking us all kinds of questions. I almost felt as if we were under a cloud of suspicion ourselves. But he assured us doggedly that he was determined to find answers. He was not comfortable with a murder on his watch. He said the answers were clearly in plain sight.
That's right, his name was Officer Johansson, says my mother. My word, that stout, small little man. He was like a bulldozer, literally digging up the ground, determined to leave no stone unturned. He wanted to know everything. He was hungry for information. I suppose it's good to have a police officer like that, so determined to solve a crime. A lot of them are too lazy to bother about any of that stuff these days. Well, what did you tell him about my marriage? I asked gingerly. I told him the truth, of course. I told him you'd been very much in love with Bruno, that you'd been married for 7 years, and that Bruno had been pushing you for children. You said you wanted to wait, and the next thing he serves you with divorce papers. I said you were very sad, but you both parted on amicable terms, and you left the state to start afresh in Philly. Of course they asked inquiring questions, especially on account that he had left everything in his will to you. Not that he had a fortune to leave, but nevertheless it would seem over the years he never met anybody else. And whenever he bumped into me in town, he'd always ask after you, saying that his biggest regret was letting you go. Really? You never told me that, Mum. What was the point? You'd moved on with your life. But Bruno, well, his relationship with women didn't last very long. I didn't want to see you getting back with him again. Not after he'd dumped you so easily the first time. I'm a mother. I'm naturally protective over my daughter. Well, you could say the same for me. My relationship history hasn't exactly been a walk in the park. I'm still very much on my own these days. Oh, yes, my mother suddenly interjects. I did tell the officer that Bruno had a big fallout with that young brother of his, who he hadn't spoken to for many years. They asked me what the fallout was about. I told them I'd absolutely no idea, but it was bad enough to ensure that his brother never wanted to speak to him again. So, of course, that got the police interest. But they caught up with him. He was out of state at the time, so he couldn't have been implicated in the murder. He had a staunch alibi. Detective Johansson could not get him to spill why he'd fallen out with his brother.
He told Officer Johansson to mind his own business, but he told Officer Johansson in no uncertain terms that he was very glad his brother was dead, and he had no sympathy for his plight. So there you are. That's the end of part 1. Part 2 is tomorrow night. Until next time, goodbye and good night.